Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales. I'm Bernette, and tonight I'm taking you to Edinburgh in the 1820s, a city praised for learning, medicine, and progress, but also a city where poverty, silence, and ambition helped create one of the most disturbing true crime cases in British history. This is my report on William Burke and William Hare, two men whose names became permanently linked to a body snatching, murder, and the darker cause of medical advancement. Before I go further, I want to be clear about the tone of this episode. This is a true crime story, and it is also a human story. I am reporting on notorious crimes, but I am also asking what those crimes reveal about poverty, class, medicine, and the people society failed to protect. So I will tell this story with atmosphere, but also with care. Here is the scene. Edinburgh, in the 1820s, was known as the Athens of the North, a center of learning, philosophy, and medical ambition, but away from the grand lecture halls and respectable streets, another Edinburgh existed. In the Westport, the streets were crowded, poor, and unstable. People rented beds where they could, worked when work was available, and disappeared from view far too easily. That is the city I want you to keep in mind tonight. To understand this case, I need to begin with the city itself. This was not only the Edinburgh of grand buildings and celebrated teachers, it was also a place of cramped rooms, damp stairwells, hunger, illness, and people living close enough to hear one another through the walls. The respectable city and the desperate city were not separate. They existed side by side. Medical students came to Edinburgh from across Britain, Ireland, Europe, and beyond. Anatomy was central to their training. It promised better surgery, better diagnosis, and better medicine. But there was a problem at the center of that progress. Anatomy schools needed bodies, and the legal supply could not meet the demand. The Westport was not some faraway underworld. It sat close to respectable Edinburgh. Students, laborers, servants, lecturers, police, sellers, drinkers, lodgers, and the desperate all crossed through the same streets. The wealthy could look away from poverty, but they could not honestly say it was hidden. It was part of the same city, the same economy, the same moral landscape. Imagine a narrow walkway after dusk. The stones are slick. Voices rise from taverns, then vanish as doors close. Somewhere a horse snorts in the dark. Somewhere else, a student hurries towards an anatomy lecture, notebook under his arm, while a woman nearby wonders whether she has enough money for a bag. This is the city Burke and Hare moved through. Not a stage set, not a living city where the poor were often noticed only when they became useful. Here are the facts. Edinburgh was one of Europe's leading centers for medical teaching. Surgeons and students needed real human remains for dissection, but the law provided too few bodies. That shortage created a black market. So-called resurrection men dug up fresh graves and sold the dead to the anatomists. Legal supply could not keep up. Dissection was often associated with punishment, especially the bodies of executed criminals. To the public, It was not a neutral scientific process. It was shame, posthumous punishment, a final humiliation after death. For ordinary families, the thought of a loved one ending up in a lecture theater was horrifying. So the need grew, and where law and demand did not meet, a black market appeared. The resurrection men did not usually steal jewelry or coffin plates, they stole the body itself. Freshness mattered, condition mattered, speed mattered. It was a business built around one of the most intimate fears a family could imagine. That sound, or the thought of that sound, haunted people. Communities guarded graves. Families paid for mort safes, iron cages placed over coffins to keep the dead in place. Watchmen sat in burial grounds. Some graveyards had watchtowers, but every new protection made a body harder to attain, and every difficulty made a fresh body more valuable. A terrible pressure was building in the dark. Now imagine the public fear. Families buried loved ones, then worried the graves itself might not be safe. Communities guarded burial grounds. Mort safes, watchtowers, and night watchmen became part of the response. But every new protection made bodies harder to obtain, and every fresh body was valuable. That is the pressure building behind this case. It is an awful thought, isn't it? Families buried loved ones, then lay awake wondering whether even the grave was safe. In some places, people used iron cages, watchmen, and heavy stones to protect the dead. Imagine mourning someone and then having to guard them after burial. But the demand continued. A fresh body had value. And when something has value, someone will always be willing to step into the dark and cross a line. This brings me to William Burke and William Hare. They were Irish immigrants living amongst Edinburgh's poor in the world of lodging houses, casual labor, drink, debt, and survival. The story began with a death in Hare's lodging house. A lodger died owing rent. Instead of dealing with the death in the ordinary way, Burke and Hare sold the body to Dr. Robert Knox's anatomy school. A lodging house is a strange setting for horror because it is neither fully private nor fully public. People pass through, they rent beds, they share rooms, they drink, argue, sleep, disappear, return, or never return at all. In a world before modern records and constant communication, a person could be known only briefly by a first name or nickname, an accent or habit, a debt, a laugh heard through a wall. That first sale, according to the known account, was not murder, but it was a turning point. In that moment, death became a transaction. A body became a way to settle a debt, and the payment was significant enough to change how these men saw the people around them. Imagine the moment after the money changed hands. The ordinary moral world should have slammed shut around them, but instead, something opened. A calculation formed. A sick person in a lodging house, a stranger without family nearby, someone whose movements no one might trace. The path from opportunity to pattern can be frighteningly short when conscience is absent and profit is waiting. The lodging house gave them access, cover, and plausible explanations. Someone moved on. Someone went looking for work. Someone drank too much and left. Someone owed money and vanished. In a city full of movement, absence did not always sound like an alarm. Sometimes it sounded like ordinary life. And that is where the case becomes colder. If a body could be sold, and if a fresh body was worth more than the dead, were no longer the only source. The living became targets. From this point, Burke and Hare no longer needed to dig in graveyards. They could create the fresh course. The anatomy trade rewarded. They targeted people who were easy to overlook: the poor, the lonely, the intoxicated, the transient. I want to stress this point. Their victims were not chosen because they mattered to no one. They were chosen because Burke and Hare believed no one with power would notice their absence. When I report on this story, I do not want the killers' names to drown out the victims. Burke and Hare became infamous. Their names became a shorthand for horror. But the people they killed were not symbols. They were human beings, people with lives, histories, and dignity. Some were poor, some were transient, some were elderly, some were isolated. Their vulnerability was not accidental to the crime. It was part of the selection. Burke and Hare chose people who could be made to disappear into the noise of the city. This is a quiet form of horror, not the dramatic scream, but the unanswered absence. This is the moment to slow down. Social invisibility means a person can be present every day and still be unprotected. Seen on stairs, served in taverns, recognized neighbors, and yet, when danger comes close, defended by no system at all, in the mind of a predator, the question, who will miss them, becomes part of the plan. The streets were atmospheric, yes. The graveyards were eerie, yes. But the core of this story is moral, not merely gothic. These were people whose bodies were assigned a market value after their lives had already been undervalued. Their method became known as Burking. I will not go into graphic detail here. It is enough to say that it was quiet, calculated, and designed to leave few obvious marks. This silence was part of the crime. The bodies were meant for anatomy rooms, where visible violence could invite questions. These murders were not frenzied. They were not chaotic. They were practical, calculated, frighteningly cold. Now to Dr. Robert Knox. Knox was a respected anatomist, and his school purchased bodies from Burke and Hare. Whether Knox knew exactly how those bodies were obtained had been debated ever since. But the question I keep returning to is not only what he knew, it is what he chose not to ask. Where did this person come from? Who were they? Who was grieving them? Why so fresh? Why so many? Why these suppliers? Why now? Those questions are the heartbeat of this part of the story. Knox does not need to become a cartoon villain for the horror to land. The more unsettling version is subtler. A respected man in a respected field. A system that rewarded results. A profession that needed material. A public that feared dissection but wanted medical progress. And at the center of it all, a silence that grew heavier with every delivery. After the crimes became known, Knox's reputation suffered deeply. Whether the law could reach him or not, public judgment did. Sometimes legality and immorality do not arrive at the same verdict. The court may ask, can this be proved? Society may ask, how could this have happened? And history may ask a colder question still. Who benefited from not looking closely? This is why I see the case as more than a crime story. Burke and Hare committed the murders, but the system created the market. Medical ambition needed bodies. The law failed to provide enough. Poverty made certain lives dangerously invisible. Between those forces, the victims were trapped. The murders ended when ordinary suspicion finally broke through the silence, not through a dramatic revelation, but through people nearby noticing that something was wrong. A room, a story, a body that should not have been there, a disappearance that finally made noise. The final known victim was Margaret Docherty, also known in some accounts as Marjorie Campbell. Her death exposed the pattern. Other lodgers became suspicious. Something did not fit. The room was too quiet. The explanations were not convincing. And this time, the silence did not hold. Her body was discovered before Burke and Hare could hide the truth completely. Suddenly, there was a named person, a body, a witness, and questions that could no longer be pushed back into the shadows. Once police were involved, stories began to clash. Small inconsistencies widened. Fears shifted from victims to the perpetrators. The partnership that had depended on secrecy began to crack. The knock, the questions, the searching eyes, the conflicting answers. Everyone in the room understands at different speeds that the story cannot hold. Horror often depends on the concealment. Justice, when it begins, can sound like a simple question asked twice. Once the police became involved, the partnership collapsed. Hare was offered immunity if he gave evidence against Burke, and he accepted. His testimony helped secure the prosecution's case. Burke was tried, convicted of murder, and sentenced to death. His partner, Helen McDougall, received the Scottish verdict of not proven. It is one of the bitterest turns in the story. After all the shared profit, silence, and guilt, survival won. Hare's testimony unlocked the prosecution, but it did not feel like clean justice. It felt like one guilty man walking away by handing over another. The trial drew enormous attention. By then, the murders were not merely crimes. They were a public nightmare. Newspapers, broadsides, rumors, songs, and street talk carried the story through Edinburgh and beyond. People wanted details. They wanted villains. They wanted reassurance that the horror had been contained. But they also wanted spectacle. That is another uncomfortable truth. The same public that recoiled from the body trade also consumed the story hungrily. Printed accounts circulated. Images were made. Names became famous. The victims again risked becoming background to the fascination with the killers. True crime has always walked that dangerous line between remembering and consuming. On January 28, 1829, William Burke was hanged in Edinburgh before a vast crowd. Then came the grim irony. His own body was dissected. The man who had sold bodies to anatomy was himself placed on the dissecting table, and his skeleton was preserved as a warning and a spectacle. Let the irony stand. A life ended on a scaffold, a body carried to the table, a skeleton preserved, a murderer transformed into an object lesson. Edinburgh had found a way to make Burke useful even after death, and that fact is as chilling as it is symbolic. The shock of the Burke and Hare murders helped push Britain towards reform. In 1832, the Anatomy Act created a legal route for medical school to obtain bodies. It reduced the demand that had fed grave robbing and murder. But even that reform raised difficult moral questions, because many of the bodies made available came from the poor and the unclaimed. This is where the story reaches beyond Burke and Hare. It becomes part of a larger history of medicine and consent. Who has the right to decide what happens to a body after death? What counts as consent when poverty limits choice? Can scientific progress be ethical if it depends on people who had the least protection in life? These questions are not trapped in the 19th century. They still echo wherever medicine, research, and human dignity meet. For me, the lasting horror is not only that people were killed for money, it is that these crimes became possible in a world where some people could disappear quietly, where poverty made them vulnerable, and where respectability could look away as long as the supply continued. The terror is not only in the alleyway, the graveyard, or the anatomy room. It is in the silence that allowed people to vanish. So when we say body snatchers, remember this story is not just about bodies. It is about people. People with names, voices, histories, and lives. People who deserve dignity. People who were turned into evidence only after they had been denied protection. That is why the Burke and Hare story still unsettles us. It asks us to look beneath the polished surface of progress and ask what and who was sacrificed along the way. It asks us to listen for the footsteps that stop suddenly in the dark and to remember the voices history almost allowed to vanish. My final thought tonight is this. I do not believe the Burke and Hare story survives simply because it is gruesome. It survives because it feels disturbingly possible. Strip away the old streets, the gas lamps, the graveyards, and the anatomy rooms, and what remains is a society deciding quietly who can vanish without consequence. Burke and Hare were responsible for what they did, but they operated in a world where their victims had already been pushed close to the edge of the light. And that is what chills me most. Not only the darkness inside two men, but the darkness around them, the respectable doors that stayed closed, the questions left unasked, the poverty that made people easy to miss, and the terrible convenience of silence. If there is a lesson here, it is not only that evil can hide the shadows, it is that sometimes the shadows are made by everyone who chooses not to look. Progress is not truly progress if it steps over the nameless. Knowledge is not noble if it is built on the unprotected. And no life should have to disappear before the world decides it matters. Before I leave you, I should mention that I have written a book about this story, The Body Snatchers, available on Amazon. If you would like to learn more about the book, the history behind this case, and my other bizarre but true tales, please visit BernetteFood.com for more information. And if this episode held your attention, please subscribe, follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with someone who enjoys true history, dark mystery, and stories that refuse to be forgotten. Your support helps keep these tales alive. As I close this report, I want to leave you with this. History is not only made by the famous, the powerful, or the monstrous. It is also made by the people who were nearly erased from it. The victims of Burke and Hare deserve more than fear, silence, and a place on an anatomy table. They deserve to be seen. They deserve to be protected. And now, at the very least, they deserve to be remembered. Thanks again for joining me for Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales. I'm Bernette, and tonight we examined the Burke and Hare case, a story of murder, medicine, poverty, and silence. If it stays with you, I hope it is not only because it was bizarre, but because it was true. Until next time, I'll be back with another strange, unsettling, and unforgettable report from history.